Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. In this video, we will discuss on chapter 2, cell structure and functions. The learning outcomes for subtopic 2.4, cell transport. Okay, first, we will overview the various transport mechanisms across the membrane. And C2, we will explain the various transport. Consists of passive transport, divided into three types: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. Whereas active transport, divided into two types: sodium-potassium pump, and also bulk transport, endocytosis and exocytosis. Before you learn further about the transport across membrane, you need to know the structure or the characteristics of cell membrane. In fact, you have learned this in subtopic 2.2, where you have learned about the structure and the characteristic and the function of the cell membrane in details. You might want to recall on that subtopic. Anyway, as you know, the cell membrane is selectively permeable. Selective means it only allows some certain substances to pass through it, while it will prevent other substances then being transported through it. Okay, so the cell membrane is permeable to lipid soluble molecule, since it's having this hydrophobic region of the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so only it's permeable to lipid soluble molecule and small nonpolar substance, and it is impermeable to polar molecules and ions. So what is the importance of this characteristic? So it will enable our cell to retain polar molecules and ions within the cell, because the polar molecules and ions are very important for our cell, so we couldn't let it escape our cell easily. Alright, so let's overview the types of transport across the membrane. Okay, so generally, transport is divided into two main types: passive transport and active transport. If you look at the definition of the passive transport, it involves the movement of substances down the concentration gradient, means from higher to lower concentration gradient. For passive transport, it does not require energy. No expenditure of energy is required. While the active transport involves the movement of substances against its concentration gradient, from lower to higher concentration. So this requires energy in the form of ATP. Okay. The passive transport is further divided into three types: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. For simple diffusion, the substances diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer without using any transport protein. For facilitated diffusion, the substances diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer with the help of the transport protein. Okay, and lastly, for osmosis, it is a mechanism that will transport water molecules across the membrane from higher to lower water potential. Let's watch a short animation to illustrate the passive transport across the membrane.
Lipids, such as these yellow molecules, can dissolve in the lipid bilayer. Notice how they move down their concentration gradient, from where they are more concentrated to where they are less concentrated. This is an example of diffusion. Diffusion is a form of passive transport. It does not require energy from the cell. Most molecules can't cross the lipid bilayer. Here, the sugar fructose moves into intestinal cells by facilitated diffusion, moving down its concentration gradient through a transport protein. Facilitated diffusion doesn't require energy from the cell, so it's also a form of passive transport. Water crosses the plasma membrane by facilitated diffusion, or by diffusing across the lipid bilayer directly. The diffusion of water across a membrane is called osmosis.
What about active transport? Active transport divided into two types, the sodium and potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump that allows these ions to be transported against their concentration gradient. And the bulk transport, transporting large molecules such as proteins and polysaccharides in bulk, in the form of vesicles or vacuoles. Okay. It's further divided into two types, endocytosis and exocytosis. Endocytosis is whereby the substances are taken into the cell, whereas exocytosis rhymes with exit. So the substances are taken out of the cell. For endocytosis, it's further divided into two types, phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Phagocytosis is a process in which large and solid particles are taken into the cell. In contrast to pinocytosis, this one involves dissolved solutes or droplets taken into the cell. Okay, so that's the overview of the transport mechanisms across the membrane. Now we will watch a short animation regarding active transport.
The sodium-potassium pump moves ions against their concentration gradient, from where they are less concentrated to where they are more concentrated. This requires energy from the cell and is known as active transport. Energy from ATP is used to move sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions in. Now let's move to the other side of our intestinal cell. Materials can be exported in vesicles that fuse with the plasma membrane and release their contents outside the cell. This process is called exocytosis. In endocytosis, the plasma membrane pinches in, forming a vesicle that contains material from outside the cell.